remember to get incorporated till 78. And you know, one of the very first issues we had to struggle with was the question of whether rehabbing housing wasn't going to displace people. And I'm thinking of Jeff's challenge to us yesterday to talk about location efficiency and value capture in context, and it's remarkable how similar the issues and the challenges are today. You know, we didn't have the data then, so all we had were bumper stickers. So we created a great one that went coast to coast, development without displacement. But that wasn't good enough to answer the question. And just before I get started here, you know, it's my observation over 33 years now that the most dynamic movements in America for change at the community level have all started with a form of disclosure, where people are struggling with finding out what's the real cost, what's the real problem, who's in charge, and moving from redlining to reinvestment required disclosure, making reinvestment something you could take charge of locally. The community development financial institutions movement took disclosure to prevent banks from moving from their primary service territories. 100 years ago, the home economics movement made it possible for people to start to get counseled formally. Today's financial literacy movements are a lineal descendant of a great idea that Ellen Richards had, that you ought to be able to teach people how to construct a budget, and the cost of living meant as much as income did. If you didn't handle both sides of that equation, you weren't going to make it through the tough economic times then. And I think that's, again, remarkably similar to what we're struggling with right now. Now, my other comment is that, you know, the question today, what if the city is the answer? What if urban character really is what we need, not only in our traditional communities, but regionally? And what if it's got to work for everybody? I think the questions that are on the table. So we're going to share with you the results of many pieces of research done over the last 20 years and show how it plays out in some regions around the country, and recommend some priority areas for innovation and deployment of this continued excellent discussion, which your sponsors have brought forth. And I want to stress that there's three themes in this besides location efficiency, which we heard Shelley talk about yesterday. One is reconnection. We can't make it as a set of isolated communities. The second is inclusion, about which we've heard quite a bit, but we can't say enough about. And the third is acceleration. We don't have forever to actually get the benefits of what we're talking about. And so thinking about ways to streamline what's good is just really, really important. Now, we heard about the Interagency Partnership for Sustainable Communities. HUD has an existing office. If the Livable Communities Act passes, we'll have an accountable set of offices working together. In fact, if the appropriations bill passes, DOT will have an office similar to the HUD office, too. Earl Blumenauer has introduced an act that would codify the Housing and Transportation Affordability Index, link it to the multiple listing services, and get it out there. But with reauthorization delayed, and James is going to give you an excellent presentation on that, I think it's time to focus for the next year or two federally on the fact that all new funds being proposed and programs are regionally focused and they're competitive. I mean, just to put some numbers on what Shelley was talking about yesterday, there'll be roughly 100 winners and 1,600 excellent proposals that also ran. I mean, there were 1,700 proposals for 100 slots. One of the few things that's been measured continuously since the 1790 census is household size. It's dropped every time it's been measured. It started out at 6 people per household. We're down to 2.6 today. If you look more recently at 1960 to 2000, it dropped from 3.3 to 2.6 people per household, but average home size being built increased from 1,400 to 2,100 square feet. One author, when I presented this at a conference, stated flat out, it looks like we're spending more and more of the national wealth building bigger and bigger homes further and further away from each other. That's a pretty good summary. That doesn't really work. That doesn't support community. It doesn't support efficiency. We can't afford it. Now, in joint work with Reconnecting America and Strategic Economics, the Center for Transit-Oriented Development looked at every census tract in the United States and matched up those demographic profiles against a lot of other things, including consumer preferences, and we came to the conclusion that at least 25% of the net growth in American households will demand housing near transit, meaning within a half mile, by 2030. Actually, I didn't put the other punchline in it, which is if you include bus access to transit, it's more like 90% will demand a form of community that allows you to get around affordably and with better access. That doesn't mean that's going to happen. It means that the demand's there. I mean, if the supply is more like the previous chart, it's not going to happen. So there is a demand for a product. One way to think about how to get there is to think about how regions succeed. I'm not going to present the numbers on this, but let me just say that successful regions move on big ideas intentionally. And the successful ones always are striving to move from an area of relative poverty to relative prosperity, and from isolation to connectedness. It turns out the most successful developments in America in the last 20 years are both in downtowns and in neighborhoods. They're mixed use, they're mixed income, they're transit-oriented development. We're looking there at the Fruitvale Transit Village, at the Bethel New Life Transit Village, in one of the poorest communities in America, in the south suburbs of Chicago and Blue Island. That luxury housing in the lower right-hand corner is the Pearl District, but 30% of it is affordable by covenant. And in the lower left-hand corner, that's the historic Third Ward of Milwaukee, where they got to redevelop an old industrial corridor along a river that had been closed off by the transportation system. Governor Tommy Thompson killed the light rail, so they swallowed hard and stuffed the area with bus service and made it walkable, and it worked anyway. You measure the value, and how can you use it to address the recession? Well, a group of us got together 20 years ago to test the common sense notion that more convenient places were worth more. I want everybody to memorize this formula. You have to take a test before going out of here. It's a lot easier to understand if you follow the curve. And what it says is the higher the density and accessibility, the less you have to drive. That's the fitted curve for 6 million households in the Bay Area, LA, and Chicago. And it works plus or minus 5%, 92% of the time. And in English, one less car per household lowers the cost of living net of transit by $5,000 to $8,000 a year. Or for a means-tested household, it's the equivalent of increasing income 10 to 20%, as I like to say, tax-free. We tested this on a mortgage product called the Location Efficient Mortgage. We think there were 2,000 mortgages made. We think that it displaced nobody. We think that based on the sample we got from Fannie Mae of 300 of those mortgages, there was only one default in it, and we think it outperformed the market. Needs a lot more test. I'm sure I'll get a question from Jeff on this one because he always gives me one. But anyway, one of the better partnerships we've ever had was with the Center for Housing Policy to address the question. They asked us, how do you quantify the drive till you qualify effect? And the effect is that as you move out from the center of city in search of that cheaper home, 10 to 15 miles out, the cost of housing drops abruptly, but the cost of transportation goes up because statistically you can actually own 1.2 cars, but in reality you go from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3, and it's very expensive. Brookings asked if we would formalize this in an affordability index. We created a way of measuring total transportation costs. We looked at it by region. And now if you go to, this is a freebie, thanks to many of the funders in this room. If you go to htaindex.org, you get access to the data for your region. All 337 regions, 161,000 census block groups. I'm going to demo this real quickly for the Bay Area. So the map on the left shows 70% for these folks. So you could end up getting fooled if you look at housing costs only into thinking you're building affordable housing, where in fact, if you manage to subsidize the cost down to affordability, in fact, the transportation will end up costing more than the house, and it won't work. There's a similar squeeze in Chicago, which has extensive transit. One of my messages here, I'm going to stop in a few minutes because I want to give James enough time too, is that it's reversible. Let's say that we look at a household with 3 cars, 35,000 miles a year driving, no transit, spends $15,000 a year on housing, 30 to 50 miles out, ends up spending 64% of their income for housing and transportation. Not good. Let's move a little closer in. 2 cars, 25,000 miles, no transit, $18,000 a year for housing, drops to 56% for housing and transportation costs at 15 miles or more out. Let's get down to 1 car per household, driving 15,000 miles a year, spending $150 a month on transit for two-wage earners, $25 a month for taxis. They've upped their housing cost to $20,000 a year, but they've dropped their combined cost to 50% for the sum of the two. Let's go now to one car driving only 7,500 miles a year in a location-efficient community, spending $125 a month for transit, $50 a month for car sharing, $21,000 a year for housing. We're now below 50% for housing plus transportation. And now let's go down to zero cars. It may sound impossible, but it actually happens. Zero cars, $200 a month for transit, $200 a month for car sharing, $22,000 a year for housing, drops it to 43% for housing plus transportation. So look what's happened. We've gone from spending $15,000 a year to $22,000 a year for housing, but when you take transportation costs into account, you've dropped the combined cost from 64% to 43% with zero cars, or 49% for one cars. Now, these numbers don't match up with the proposed index well. So U.S. DOT grants credit to state DOTs for economic development benefits because they're hiring a lot of people, spending a lot of money, and allegedly saving us time in traffic, but there's no credit given for reduction in the cost of living or increase in taxable value or any of the things that any local official in this room would recognize as worth running for office on. So this is actually in use today in the Bay Area. They've set a goal of reducing the combined cost of housing and transportation, in part because of James's excellent work. This has helped justify putting public money into Match Foundation money in a Todd Collaborative Fund. In El Paso, Texas, a couple weeks ago, they actually passed a law in the City Council to screen all affordable housing investments from now on their combined housing and transportation cost impact. We've identified at least 40 jurisdictions and one state, Illinois, that have adopted some form of legislation or rule to move this. The new Livable Communities Act and the other act I mentioned, the Housing and Transportation Affordability Act, would codify all this. Well, all this is on the website. www.cnt.org, or the other one that I gave you. There's materials out there. Read this one, Penny Wise and Pound Foolish, and I'm going to stop there, and we'll be available for questions. Thank you very much.